Okay, well, before we get started, would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and like your academic work?
Yeah, sure. I was born in the UK to Italian parents who'd emigrated to London, and so educated in Britain, went to university in Britain, and by the time I began to study history in terms of postgraduate PhD, I was very interested in modern Italy, and then I met my future wife, and her name is Daniela Barattieri, and Barattieri, as we might get to in as we discuss, is a familiar name to anybody that knows anything about the Battle of Adwa. And of course, I inquired, as she had in her house, that she had this photograph of this rather kind of pompous looking general. And she said, yeah, he's my great uncle or something. She wasn't quite sure exactly what he didn't have any children, but he was some kind of relative of hers. So, that got me interested in looking into who this guy was. And that led me to do a PhD on kind of Italian culture during Italy's African wars in the late 19th century. And, Barattieri came up every so often, of course. And, then I suppose I began to work in that field and, wrote my PhD on kind of Italian culture and the way in which, these wars that were going on in Africa in the late 19th century, how far they kind of reverberated, had some resonance amongst the Italian population. Did the Italian population care about them? In what way were they talked about? And that kind of thing. And then that led on to sort of getting into the subject. And, I've written a kind of 3-volume history of Italian colonialism. I've published the first volume 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm now working on the second, and hopefully that will be finished. I've been saying it for quite a few years that that'll be finished. Right. But it should be finished in let's just say by next year, I hope. And then, of course, I'm going to go on to the next, which will this one deals with Italian Empire, in around the period of the First World War and the conquest of Libya before that. And the next one will deal with kind of fascist empire building in the 1920s and 30s.
Wow.
So that's what I'm doing.
Wow, that's great. I mean, you got a lot of work to do, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my first question, this may or may not be, within your area, but I know that I've come across certain academic articles, right, that talk about Italy's encounter with East Africa, Ethiopia, in the late medieval sort of Renaissance period, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't actually like confrontational,
right.
Much more diplomatic. If you can, would you mind speaking on that a little bit? I mean,
yeah, I mean first you have to, of course, going back to that period, the distances are enormous. So the contact was there, but often they were these kind of diplomatic missions that took a year to get to Europe for Ethiopians, and for any Italians that ventured in that direction, the same. And so there was this contact. Yeah, it had absolutely nothing to do with kind of conquest or anything like that. Right. But where the connection was, I think you can see it in 2 ways in that period. One, of course, was that Italy was in the late medieval and Renaissance period the kind of the economic entry point into Europe from the Middle East. And of course, Ethiopia had contacts, and had established pathways into the Mediterranean via Egypt, and of course via the Red Sea. which we have to remember in this period, Egypt and North Africa and, the Middle East are Muslim, possessions first, Arab, parts of the Arab world, but we have a process of, the Ottoman conquest of the area going on in the late medieval and early Renaissance period. So you have this Christian empire in the kind of heart of Africa. Then you have the Muslim world above it, and then the Mediterranean world. And, there are economic contacts between the Mediterranean world and the Red Sea and that into the Indian Ocean that are going on. And, this brings Ethiopians in contact with, places like Venice, which is really the kind of the entry point of most Eastern Mediterranean trade into Western Europe. So that's one thing, and there are contacts. There's business contact. There are, of course, Ethiopian communities in Jerusalem, in Cyprus, and in North Africa, in Alexandria. Yeah, so there you do have a much more direct connection. Then there's the other, which is, of course, the religious connection, and Rome is, of course, the papacy is in Rome, and while the Ethiopian church is, of course, independent, it's not, anything to do as such with the Roman church. Nevertheless, there is pilgrimages that take place to Rome, of course, the seat of St. Peter and St. Paul. There is and I think certainly in the early 1400s, there's this desire to bring the Christian churches together because of the Ottoman threat, the Muslim Ottoman threat that is going on. Constantinople falls in the mid 15th century, yeah. But even before that, there's a council that takes place in Florence that is an attempt to kind of reunite the Eastern and Western churches. Right. And there is an Ethiopian delegation there, yeah, which is also interesting. How does Christianity, of course, you have to imagine this is a period of kind of resurging Islamic power through the Ottoman conquests in the Mediterranean. So, and of course, this is also threatening down the Red Sea to the Ethiopian Christian empire itself. And so there is an attempt. It doesn't come to anything. There is an attempt to, to bring some kind of unity amongst Christians in relation to that threat. Okay. So although that doesn't actually happen, and of course, in part because what the Roman Church wants is, to bring everybody under its own, power, if you like. Yeah, of course, it's spiritual power. It's not politics, but it's, and there is an attempt. And as the years go by, so we're talking about the early Renaissance now. Of course, what happens then is the great discoveries by the Portuguese and the Spanish that begin to circumnavigate the globe. America is discovered in the late 1400s, and of course Vasco da Gama makes his trip around Africa. This is the first time that happens. So suddenly Ethiopia becomes accessible, and East Africa in general becomes accessible no longer through, if you like, the Muslim world, but around Africa, and Europeans have got a direct route to there. And we have the growth of this idea, this myth of what's called the myth of Prester John, which is that had kind of permeated Europe since Marco Polo's travels. It talked about the fact that there was this weird Christian kingdom far away, deep beyond the Islamic world. Yes. And it inspired many Europeans to kind of remake that connection, and of course that would mean finding an ally. This was the hope, finding an ally against resurgent Islam and the Islamic kind of if you think of the map, Islam is there in the middle. Where exactly Prester John was was kind of unknown. There was this myth that for a long time was permeated
He was
Europe,
in India.
in
You
India.
know, he was over in the east somewhere, and then he found. Yeah,
Yeah, I
I
mean, it wasn't. I mean, of course, there were, everybody knew in Europe that there were Christians in Egypt, and
mhm,
and of course that there were Christians in India too. But here you had this image of this, empire, this monarch
right.
somewhere,
Hmm.
and this would be a monarch, with which, an alliance could somehow be made, and perhaps, the Islamic kind of tide could be thrown back, and so on and so forth. And of course, the Portuguese, who are the first to circumnavigate Africa,
Hmm.
um, and they land in Mombasa, and then land in various places in East Africa.
Hmm.
And well, they suddenly realize there is this, the Ethiopian monarch is the man, is Prester John. And of
Right.
course, the Ethiopians themselves in this moment in time, we're talking about now the kind of early 1500s,
Yes.
are, so I'm going on a bit, but
No, it's okay.
are also very happy to welcome the Portuguese, because they offer a kind of, military hardware,
Yes.
soldiers,
Yeah.
that they can, of
Yeah.
course, use in their own struggles that are going on, against, Islamic power along the Red Sea coast. So,
Right.
there's this extraordinary alliance that is forged,
Yes.
uh, between the Portuguese. And of course, in that sense, there are lots, when one says Portuguese, and there's lots of priests, and there are missions from Europe that
Mhm.
are contacting Ethiopia through this Portuguese adventure. And of course, many of those are Italians. I mean, so and of course, what does the church want? The Catholic Church wants is somehow, that Ethiopia will, rejoin. This is the way they put it, rejoin, even though it had never been part of the Roman Church, but would join the universal church. And then, and so, and from this period here in which this contact is made between the Portuguese and Ethiopia, there's, a long period of about 100 years,
Uh-huh.
in which, the contacts are relatively close with Europe. And you
Yeah.
would have, you've got Franciscans, which are orders of the Catholic Church. You've got Jesuits
Uh-huh.
that are attempting to, in fact, convert Coptic Christians to Catholicism. And, they're fairly successful, at least with, some of the upper echelons of
Yes.
Ethiopian society in that period.
Right.
And, it does look like, and of course, many of these are Italians. Yeah, many of these travelers and so on, and missionaries are
Right.
Italians. Yeah, and so the contact remains in that sense.
Yes.
And of course, by the in around the mid 1600s,
Uh-huh.
the Ethiopian Emperor Fasilides, understands that the Jesuit conversion, if you like, of Ethiopian Coptic Christianity to Catholicism is, has its downside. And that downside is, of course, that perhaps, Ethiopia will fall under European kind of tutelage, and he expels the Jesuits, a bit like in Japan. This happens in Japan as well. Japan has, allows the Jesuits in, and it's fascinated by what they have to offer, their ideas, their technology, and so on and so forth. But then at a certain point, it's realized that, this isn't just about, philosophy and religion. It's
Right.
also perhaps about, and they are expelled, and they're also expelled from Ethiopia. So then you have Ethiopia, in a sense, very isolated from Europe,
Yes.
until the middle of the 19th century. So the Coptic Church regains its kind of, I suppose,
Hegemony.
independence.
Yeah.
But at the same time, but nevertheless, through this long period of time, the empire survives. It does not succumb to, Islamic expansion in the
Right.
area, and of
Yes.
course is there in the 19th century when this contact comes back. So,
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. I mean I mean that's a good rundown from the medieval ages
Yeah,
into what would ultimately, I guess, become the relationship between Europe and East Africa, North Africa, right? And um, you know, I guess uh, at what point do Italians and say, East Africa begin
yeah,
to sort of run into start butting heads, right?
right.
Um, I know that Italy at some point in time.
Why does it become interested in that area in particular?
Yeah, I mean, why does it become interested in that area? But also it's the fact that Italy, has been sort of described as being sort of the weaker link,
Right,
right, in the European colonial enterprise, right? Like France and Great Britain have these, vast empires, and they're looking to basically control, major parts of Africa, from the north all the way down to the south. And um, you know, Italy sort of comes up on the mark and say, hey, we want to be part of that too. You know, I mean, can you tell me a little bit about how that sort of unfolded?
but I mean, the first thing to point out is, of course, Italy doesn't exist until when I, until let's just say 1870. Yeah.
Okay.
So Italy as a nation is not unified, does not come together as a nation. What you have before that is a lot of smaller states within
Right.
Italy. You have some that are controlled. For example, until 1867, Venice is actually controlled by Austria, yeah, by the
Right.
Austrian Empire, and so too other areas of northern Italy. You
Mm-hmm.
have you have a number of smaller states. So Italy, some of which are kind of independent, but not very powerful, simply because they're very small. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Um, and that had been the case. Well, Italy had never been unified since. Well, you could have to go back to the Roman Empire to actually say that Italy exists. So in one way, these were small states that had no very small navies.
Mm-hmm.
Naples, southern Italy, the capital city was Naples, called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. It
Right.
had a tiny fleet.
Right.
Venice, as I said, belonged to Austria. Um, Piedmont which is the area centered on the city of Turin in northwestern, was independent, but again, a kind of landlocked. Um, well, it's not landlocked because it has the port of Genoa, but these are small states that certainly don't have any kind of power of expansion in the early 19th century, very differently from France and Britain, that are, of
Right.
course, or Spain or
Portugal.
Portugal, that have got this long history of
Yeah.
expansion
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. So Italy doesn't actually exist.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the process, what happens over the 19th century is there's this process. It's called the Risorgimento, which means, the kind of the rebirth. It's not the Renaissance. The Renaissance is about
Okay.
art, but this is the rebirth of Italy.
Right.
And so Italy, and this happens in lots of other places in Europe in the 19th century. This is, of course, the birth of, what we understand as modern nationalism that takes place after the French Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
with the ideas that are kind of percolating throughout Europe over the 19th century. Sorry, after the French Revolution, about national, that states should be based on this idea of national populations rather than imperial, you know collection of territories that are owned by some king or other. Yeah, so there's
Right.
this idea that Europe is divided into nationalities. There's France, there's Germany, there's Italy, there's Poland, whatever, and these should be this is what the nationalists that are inspired by the French revolutionary ideas. Now, this is what they believe. And of course, this process begins in Italy in the early 19th century, and after lots of vicissitudes, ends up as a unified Italy through a series of wars, through also a series of kind of from below uprisings, a lot of revolutionaries inspired by republicanism, inspired by the US in many ways. This is what a nation should look like. It should be a republic. It should be, representative of the people. It should, give the vote to everybody. It should be democratic, and so on and so forth. So Italy comes into being through a kind of popular uprising from below, which but also the expansion of that state that I told you about, Piedmont, which is a kind of more modern constitutional monarchy, and also, of course, the great powers that are vying for power. When I say the great powers, Austria, Britain, France, these are all countries that are looking closely at what Italy, all these different statelets are doing, and some are happy that Italy comes together as a unified state. Perhaps Austria isn't, but Britain is quite happy. France also kind of helps Italy to come together. And anyway, to cut a long story short, Italy, finally does become one state.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean that everybody in Italy is happy about it, but especially the Pope. Remember the Pope in Rome, and the Pope has had his city in 1870 kind of taken away from him. And he basically tells Catholics that no, don't participate in what's going on, and so on and so forth. Rome has always been the Pope. So you have already this Italy comes into being, but it's an Italy that is problematic because in some areas, it wasn't an uprising; it was conquered to bring it together. In some areas, of course, they're Catholics. Perhaps the Pope is saying, this is the worst thing that has ever happened. The city of Rome itself becomes its capital, but the Pope does not recognize the new state. He says, that this is theft. And he's, of course, appealing to Catholics across the world to not recognize the legitimacy of this Italian state. So it's a state that's born in conflict. And talking really a lot again, but that's the story. And of course there are other, Germany comes into being at the same time, around the 1870s. So you have the birth of these new nation states in Europe, and some fail to do that. There are rebellions in Poland that attempts to form a nation, but it fails and it remains under Russia, and so on. And there are revolts throughout the 19th century trying to create these nations. Italy and Germany, of course, it succeeds. And of course, this disbalance is the whole, this unbalances rather the whole, political order in Europe, but also in terms globally as well. So these are new nations. They of course have got both Germany and Italy, a new nation. They have no empires because they haven't been around very long. And now that you've got Italy, as a famous Italian, MP that looked, once Italy was created in 1870, said, now we've made Italy, but now we have to make Italians. And what does it mean, making Italians? It's like, what has this new nation got to offer its people? Its legitimacy is ultimately, it talks in those terms. Its legitimacy is not just some king that, it's about delivering the goods. To this is what you want a nation for. It's the same story that America has about itself. It's not just, why is America worthwhile? Because it gives such great things to its population. That's what it says. And Italy's the same. It's like, and so the colonial issue becomes immediately apparent. Should these new powers also become involved in the colonial? Should they just leave the rest of the world, to France or Britain, who were lucky enough to be around for a long time, or should Italy also, look globally. After all, isn't that what makes a country rich? Isn't that what makes a country successful? You know, you look at Britain. Why is it so successful in the 20th century? Has this incredible trading, empire. It has, everywhere across the globe. It has contacts. It has influence.
Mm-hmm.
It's fantastic, isn't it? That's, and so the model that is followed by these new countries is, we're not going to just come together and it's like, okay, Italy's done now, we can just look at the Roman ruins and
Right.
you know what I mean. It's like
just check out the old stuff and look around and see how beautiful it used to be. A romantic
yeah, and I mean you can't do that because your population is poor.
Mm-hmm.
After all, this is the period in which the mass migration to America is taking place. People don't leave their country just because they want to see the world. It's because there is mass poverty, overpopulation. So the kind of security of this Italian state that comes into being is not guaranteed. As I said, the Pope's against it. The South is very poor. Mm-hmm. The legitimacy of this new construct is, by no means kind of guaranteed. Mm-hmm. And, the only thing that would guarantee it would be, of course, economic development. This is this is the problem that faces, all new nations. Think of African nations, after independence. It's like what will guarantee their legitimacy will be economic development, a population that sees itself reflected in what the state does, a government that they see as representative, mm-hmm. and so on and so forth. And of course, you have to find pathways to get better. And that's what Italy was trying to do. That's what the ruling elite that had kind of taken command of this new Italy was trying to do in the late 19th century. And, one option is colonialism. Yes. If Britain's doing so well, if France is doing so well, these are the examples. Even America is like, well, why is America doing so well? Well, it's got masses of land. It's got, it needs millions of people to work. And, can Italy just, as we said, kind of relax, look back, and say, weren't we great once in the Renaissance? No, the idea is Italy should develop and catch up to everybody else. And one of the means by which this is done is, of course, staking out claims across the world. It's what everybody else is doing. In 1869, the Suez Canal is opened.
Okay. Yes.
And suddenly the route to the east is now once again through the Mediterranean. Yeah. So Italy, a lot of people in Italy, let's say writers, elite thinkers, economists, politicians, they think with the opening of the Suez Canal, Italy will, once again occupy this kind of strategic position.
Right.
That it had lost, of course, with the discovery of America. The Mediterranean was no longer the center of the world, but the Suez Canal suddenly, makes it look like Italy's and so Italy has to get going, it has to look, it has to find territory, maybe some coaling stations, mm-hmm. and so on and so forth, if we're going to trade with the East, all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So, And of course, this is the moment in which the scramble for Africa happens. Yeah, the scramble for Africa happens and begins in the 1880s. Mm-hmm. Britain is taking this bit. France is, of course, taking what it can. There are the old Portuguese and Spanish colonies there. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, the whole of Africa is up for grabs. It's a long discussion why that happens when it does. Yes. But what Italy is asking itself, or what Italian leaders, because when I say Italy, I don't mean, the vast population. I mean, the politicians, the thinkers, yes. the writers, the elites, yes. are saying, shouldn't we be involved as well? Mm-hmm. And of course, there are Italians in Africa already, in East Africa in particular. There are first a series of missionaries that are there. The Catholic Church itself has also, remember that the Catholic Church in the 19th century is like, most of the world is falling to the British, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. That's
what I mean. And or even the South American colonies that had been part of the Spanish Empire, they have become independent. A lot of them are anti-clerical.
Right.
Mm-hmm. The church is, can it just leave, the British to take over the world, which of course means more Protestants, if anything. And so the church also has, the church is, in a sense, it's a soft power empire in the 19th century still. It doesn't own land, but it of course has its missionaries. And there's a massive expansion of missionary activity of the Catholic Church in Africa, but of course also in Asia. But mostly, in Africa, and many of these are Italians. When I say Italians, they're from Italy, but they're not representative of the Italian state. They are simply missionaries working for, the Vincentian order, for example, which is actually based in Paris. Or they might be Franciscans, which is, of course, Italian, but it's not really Italian. Or Jesuits, they are there on the spot. People like De Jacobis, Comboni, they are, missionaries working in East Africa, and they are of course let in by Ethiopia and its various kingdoms at this point in time. Are now, we've gone back to, they're quite happy to have missionaries, partly because if we're talking about the 1850s, 60s, we have in Ethiopia at this time the south, which is kind of what Showa is kind of ruled by the young Menelik. The north is under the Ethiopian proper in the 1860s, so Johannes. And both of them are quite happy to have missionaries. Why? Because missionaries are the contact with Europe, and Europe is of course the channel through which you can get guns. Most importantly in there, because the way you have to imagine East Africa in say 1850 onwards is that, and certainly when it becomes the scramble for Africa, i.e. when Europeans become involved heavily there in the 1880s, is that there are a series of contending empires. There's a kind of weakening Ottoman Empire along the coast. The Egyptian power, Egypt belongs to the Ottoman Empire, but Egypt, whose power had run all the way down to Ethiopia's northern borders, for time immemorial, let's put it that way.
Sudan or something like that, right?
Sorry?
Is this like the region of Sudan, like bordering between Sudan and Eritrea?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And Sudan, though, had in the early 1880s had there'd been this kind of the Mahdist revolt, which was a kind of Islamic revival movement which had kind of thrown off Egyptian power. So each and was basically an independent Muslim state at this point, if you can call it a state, in the 1880s. So Egypt's power is waning throughout East Africa. You have, of course, Johannes, who is, the Ethiopian emperor in northern Ethiopia. You have Menelik, who's his subordinate, who wants to be emperor himself, but is also conquering an empire further south. Is moving into this what now would be the Somali borders, Oromia, and conquering what are Muslim populations in that area. And then we have, the entry into the area in the 1880s of, the Italians, and then the Germans. So there's a lot of contending different empires that are going on. Why Italy finally gets involved is there are various missionaries. So actually, to bring back the discussion, what I wanted to say was the Ethiopian rulers are happy to have these missionaries because they represent, as I said, a kind of a conduit to Europe, and Europe, they know full well, is where all the most up-to-date arms are coming from in their own kind of empire building. They need guns, and the missionaries, despite themselves, often have to end up being kind of arms salesmen for for Menelik, for example. Masaya, who's at Menelik's court for 20 years.
Wow.
Is he's this humble Franciscan, but nevertheless, Menelik saying to him, look, I like what you're doing. I'm allowing you to preach.
Right.
And so on. But, you have to give me some contacts in order to
Yeah.
get,
Play
and
your
so
part.
on, some guns and stuff like that. So he ends up almost being a kind of, and then there, of course, are explorers who are certainly not missionaries in the sense of the church. They're, modern missionaries. They're, discovering the sources of the Nile, or, or ethnographers, and lots of these are Italians in this area. And, there's a kind of almost imperceptible transformation that takes place between these just Italian citizens. And remember, when I say Italian, Italy kind of didn't exist until 1870. But then suddenly, while they're exploring or being missionaries in these areas, Italy comes into being as a nation. And so suddenly they find themselves actually being not, Masaya is Piedmontese. So, he's just a little, or Sapito, who ends up being the first person that actually acquires territory for Italy, is also Piedmontese. But while he's doing that, the Suez Canal opens and Italy becomes united. So suddenly he thinks, wow, we can do what the British do. We can take territory here as well and, turn it into a kind of normal colony. So in this rather messy situation, the Italian state eventually becomes involved, in part because once the scramble for Africa kind of gets underway, in part the British want the Italians to be involved in East Africa.
Yes.
Why do the British want the Italians? Well, because it's this new country that they, it's like the big boss man has got this new kind of little country that is like in the playground. It's like the big boss with his little helper, as it were. And of course, Britain is they say, well, why not have Italy there rather than France? Their main rival is France. Yes. So it's like, why don't we encourage? And it also works really well for Britain. The scramble for Africa is this idea that, not one country will take over, but it's a kind of collective European enterprise. And so there is competition in it, but there's also this idea of a Europe that is acting in unison, each doing his bit to civilize, different bits of Africa. So of course there's rivalry there, and you can look at the scramble for Africa in terms of a series of rivalries, which is in fact the case.
Right.
But at the same time, there's also this collective sense that is being kind of sold to the various European populations. This sense of saying, Britain will take this bit, France this bit, Italy this, and it's like saying, so Italians are getting the sense, well, we have to do our bit as well. Of course, it's in our interest, but it's also part of this, process of civilizing the African. That we need to participate in. Because if we don't, if we don't participate in, we're not living up to the high moral standards of the other powers.
Right. So, and then you mentioned this whole thing of Protestantism, and so it's kind of like on one hand, it's kind of like, well, there's this competition for, Christianization, within Africa and elsewhere, but here's my thing. Okay. And I really want to know this. Why, if Great Britain and France and say Italy, if they know, well, maybe they didn't know, right? But let's just say, for the sake of conversation, they knew that the Horn of Africa, particularly what would become Eritrea and Ethiopia, was predominantly Christian, right? In a, of a different denomination, Oriental Orthodox. Why does Sapato, right, who is I believe who is a missionary, who's a cleric, right? Why do they perceive this mission as a Christianization or a missionary thing? Because it's like, well, a house divided against itself can't stand. You know what I mean? What are you after?
Right. Well, I mean, first thing to say is of course, though the Ethiopia is, as you said, kind of predominantly Christian, there are vast populations that aren't in the area that so there is that. But there is certainly amongst Catholic and other, there's this idea that Ethiopia, yes, is Christian, but it has left behind, it's lapsed, it's kind of lost, there's a sense that it has kind of lost its contact with the true center of Christianity. As a Catholic, it would be, Rome. It's lost that contact. It's lost, and effectively what it needs is a kind of re-Christianization. Okay. This is something, of course, that Ethiopians, kind of don't understand. They go like, if you, why are you coming here to convert us? We're already Christian. Why don't you, try and convert the Muslims? Right. Of course, it's very difficult to convert Muslims. Yes. Very difficult indeed. Hardly any are converted. Right. But that's the idea. I think the idea there is to bring it under a kind of, to return the contact with Rome, or what they imagine to be a return. And that, Messiah is he's there for 30 years. He looks at the Ethiopian clerics and he says, they're uneducated. They don't know what they're talking about. They're corrupt. This is his idea. Yeah. So it's not a partnership that he wants to see with them. He believes that, and he looks at Ethiopian society and he doesn't, he says, well, there's lots of, it's corrupt. They don't believe in marriage and monogamy in the way we do in Europe. It's a Christianity that has been corrupted by distance, and being isolated, but also perhaps a bit by Islam and the influence of Islam. And so therefore they see it as a kind of purification. Of course, for what we would call the kind of and Sapito, you mentioned Sapito, he's a fantastic example, because he of course starts off as a Vincentian. This is the St. Vincent de Paul's order, which is a kind of missionary order. He starts off as a missionary, okay, for a long time, but then of course, various vicissitudes in his life, he shacks up with various women in the kind of thing that you don't do as a Catholic missionary, or you shouldn't do. Yeah. And then Italy comes into being, and suddenly he realizes, I can be a missionary, but no longer for Catholicism, for civilization, for modern civilization, in the sense of understood as, the European nation state. So he actually does that, right. Directly. He goes from being a kind of Catholic missionary to being what we would call the modern scientist, diplomatic, they're still called missionaries. Why are they called missionary? They're kind of, what they're bringing now is not Christianity as such, but they're bringing civilization. Right. And they're not interested in converting any longer to Catholicism. And of course, you have this whole, it's not about converting East Africa to Catholicism, but it's about bringing civilization to this area. Okay. That's the way. And what it means, what does it mean by civilization? Education, roads, writing, modern economy, that kind of thing. Of course, that's the discourse that is going on. It's like these are areas that have been, somehow locked in the past, left behind, and Europe is there to develop these areas. Of course, it's there to develop them for our benefit, but also for the benefit of the local population. So the idea of kind of converting, it almost seamlessly goes from, converting to Catholic Christianity or something like that, right, to converting, i.e., making of the African a modern man. Right. Yeah. Right. Now, that's an interesting point, because,
one, I had discovered that, many, well, I don't know, maybe this is not many. I should take that back that statement. Soldiers who had arrived in East Africa, Italian soldiers, right, who had arrived in East Africa, had developed relationships with local women, right? And this is not to make, I'm not trying to say anything negative. I mean, it happens, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But you know, with this kind of civilizing mission, right?
Yeah.
Are our Italian soldiers thinking in the same way? Like, okay, we're going to marry these women, we're going to have relationships and have children, and then turn around and say, well, we don't want to, we don't want to take care of the children.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
we're just, we're
Well,
kind of, yeah.
yeah, I mean, what the Italians, I mean, so Italy occupies, these areas along the East African coast, and of course, it's very much done through, planting in various towns, Massawa, Assab, along the East African coast, and then eventually in various towns in Somalia. By setting up military, the vast majority of Italians in these areas until the 1920s are soldiers. Yeah. And do they believe that? Yeah, I suppose they believe in a kind of way that they're bringing civilization. But that doesn't stop them. They certainly don't want to mix. I mean, some do. There are some soldiers and some guys that are out there, working in Massawa or whatever, that end up marrying, local women.
Yeah.
The soldiers, I think, is much more just, while we're there, we have a bit of a good time because, we we're far away from home. We don't have to, behave like we do at home. There's a lot of that kind of going on. Of course, there's a discrepancy of power that exists between the Italians. Immediately, they're often much richer than a lot of poor women in these areas, and there's there's that kind of relationship going on.
Yeah.
So, do the soldiers see themselves, a lot of them say, let's just have, a good time while we can, or whatever, while they're stationed there. Others, much more seriously, they do think that Italy is doing something, worthwhile. And, we're bringing our, others are merely, others are, there's a whole panoply, what you can call a spectrum of behavior, from brutal rapists, to guys that marry and love their wives. Some bring them back to Italy. Others have children. Most, if they have children, they leave them there. But some carry on sending money to their wife, and so on. Others don't. It's a very mixed. I mean, I think that on the whole, the view of the soldier, and this becomes the kind of myth in Italian Empire, is that you can go out there and have fun with women in a way that you can't at home. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's, there's this, it's like, it almost becomes a myth of, it's an extraordinary myth that this macho Italy has. It's like, we didn't have a very good empire, but we had the most beautiful women,
right.
Really incredibly is there. It's like, Somalia and Ethiopia, the most beautiful women in Africa. And we didn't conquer the best bits of Africa like the British and so on, but we had that. There is this kind of macho thing about it. And lots of Italian men, this is the empire of the 1930s,
Yes.
Look back, with nostalgia. They're all probably dead now, but they look back with nostalgia at their youth in Ethiopia or Somalia, where the rules that they had at home didn't quite apply.
Right.
And enjoyed their stay there, as it were. There were always lots more men than women,
right,
so on and so forth. Whether they interpreted that as civilization, I suppose, there was this sense of racial superiority, that existed, and that Italy was ultimately doing good there, building roads and so on and so forth. That was a long time in the future.
I heard I had a professor back in the day who wrote a book on the Battle of Ottawa,
All right.
University of Washington, and he made this statement. He said, their problems are not our problems.
Right.
You can't, equate what they were going through, with our situation, now or today,
Right.
and maybe we can get to that later, but leading into that, I mean, with the Battle of Ottawa,
Right. Yeah, you should.
and everything, right? Um, you know, what sort of transpired there? I mean, I know the whole thing about like the Treaty of Wuchale, right? Like the Italians signed something, and then like the Ethiopians signed something else, and it's sort of reinterpreted for the Ethiopians,
Yeah.
and then it kind of culminates into this sort of like the Italians say, well, you're not honoring the agreement, and the Ethiopians say, well, that's not what it that's not what it originally said in the first place. So, I mean, they're going at it, right? And then, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but eventually, I mean, there's they get into a war, right? And, Menelik, at one point, he kind of stops himself from, going further into what would become Eritrea, right? He said, I don't want to, like, go ahead and take that land, right? Like, I don't want to, it's just a backwards play, whatever. I don't know. I'm paraphrasing, right? And so, does that sort of solidify Italy's hold over that region?
Well, all right. Let's. I mean, to go back. So I suppose we've left it that there are these missionaries, and Italy's kind of put its foot into Eritrea, partly because the British, say, why don't you occupy it? In order for that and Eritrea. Remember, let's just say it's kind of along the coast of East Africa. Then of Ethiopia, then the mountains begin, and then you get to kind of what we would call kind of Ethiopia proper, the highlands, and the Italians at first are just occupying the port, but then they begin to see that Ethiopia hasn't been claimed by anybody in the scramble for Africa. The British, remember, they enter Ethiopia in 1868. There's an expedition, much more reminiscent of kind of American expeditions in the 20th century. It's not that they go in there, they get rid of the empire. There's a kind of the Ethiopian emperor at the time, Theodros, captures a British envoy and doesn't want to give him up. So the British say, you can't do that. You have to. And the emperor says no. And so Britain organizes this huge expedition into Ethiopia in the 1860s.
Right.
And Theodros is defeated by the British, but the British kind of leave, and they leave a lot of their guns to the guy that eventually becomes the emperor, Johannes. But the Italians, so they're on the coast, and they begin to, kind of become, interested further afield inland, and so there's, through Eritrea, there's a kind of expansion going on a little bit as Italy expands its land inward, and that leads to the first battle between the Ethiopians. And when we say the Ethiopians, I mean northern Ethiopia under Johannes. That leads to what's known as the Battle of Dogali in 1887, in which the Italians, a column of Italians, is destroyed by Ethiopian troops, and this leads to a massive kind of, in Italy something has to be done, and there's a huge desire for vengeance, and thousands of troops are sent to Italy to kind of make up for that little defeat. So there's a kind of conflict brewing in the north between Italians in Eritrea, and at the same time there's a diplomatic mission from the south into Shoa. Remember, Menelik is king of Shoa. He's yet not Ethiopian emperor in the 1880s, And this is when the Treaty of Ucciale that you're talking about is signed. And what Menelik wants from Italy is essentially he wants to become emperor himself, and his rival is Johannes in the north. And so he wants as much as he can get from the Italians, mostly guns, but also some kind of, diplomatic recognition of his future claims to be emperor.
Right.
So the Treaty of Ucciale is signed, and of course there is that thing that you're talking about, in which the Italians kind of say, on their version, it's like, Menelik has become Italy's protectee,
right,
which is very important in European diplomatic and legal talk. Yeah,
right.
And on the other, in the Amharic version, it's kind of, Italy will protect Ethiopia if it so desires to be protected. Right. So this is the difference between the two.
Right.
But Menelik isn't really aware of this difference for a long time, and the Italians, maybe they've kind of this is Antonelli, the kind of the diplomat that is in at the Shannon court, and now at the beginning of the city of Addis Ababa. And whether he's tricked him on purpose, but anyway, he goes back to Europe saying, look, Ethiopia, well, it's still only Shoa, but Ethiopia has kind of asked for Italy's protection. Of course, what this means is that on the maps of Europe, on the European maps, this bit of territory has become kind of colored of the country, a European country that has got this protectorate. And effectively what it does is it excludes all other European powers from having any influence in the area. Yeah. Right. What it means is that the local ruler who has accepted to be protected, can no longer approach any of the powers by himself. He can only do so through, the protecting power.
Yes.
So Menelik has signed this. At the same time, there's conflict brewing in the north. So, what are these called in Italian is the kind of the policy of the south and the policy of the north, or the Shoan or the Tigrayan policy, from the north. But of course, in 1889, Johannes is killed fighting the Mahdists.
Yes. Okay.
And so suddenly, there's no real, there is a rival at first, but suddenly Menelik becomes the emperor of Ethiopia. Whereas before he was prepared to kind of tolerate, the Italians moving from the north into Tigray,
right?
Now he's emperor because, of course, they were a problem for Johannes. Yeah, do you see what I'm getting at? And he was moving from the south, so Menelik is always regarded as this great hero, which of course he is. But he was like all Ethiopian aristocrats. It's like a fight club between those guys. It's like they are. They kind of stick together when they need to, but they're rivals. These are guys. These are testosterone filled.
It's like Italy before its unification.
Yeah, exactly. So they fight each other. Yeah, and Menelik suddenly, so with the death of Johannes, who dies gloriously in battle, one of the last battles that no European is present, at the battle between Tigrayan troops.
Yes.
The Battle of Metemma and Mahdist Islamic, fanatics.
Yes.
This battle takes place. It's one of the last kind of, I would say, the last war in Africa in which kind of Europeans aren't there to look on at what's going on, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. And it's a last. After that, Europeans are always involved. And he dies, and of course that opens the throne of the King of Kings. Now he is now Menelik is a king, and so suddenly Italy becomes not this kind of how they could help him take the throne, but Italy now becomes the encroaching power in Tigray.
Okay,
and so and Tigray has become his responsibility, to protect.
Okay.
And so there is tension. And of course, what comes out immediately in about 1890, and at this point, Menelik is the great friend of Italy. He sends a mission to, Ras Makonnen goes to Italy, and it's a huge, wonderful journey that takes place. He's shown all the sites, and it's interesting. He's shown kind of the sites, Rome and Naples, and all the cities. It's wonderful to impress this, Ethiopian lord.
Yes.
But he's also brought to kind of, steel factories and arms manufacture, just to show, how powerful. Of course, he's not allowed to go to the Ras Makonnen, who's of course the father of Rastafari, that becomes he becomes the emperor, the famous emperor in the 20th century. But he's not really allowed to go to other countries, so that he really is impressed, with it. Maybe if he'd have gone to Britain or France, Italy, is strong, but not that strong.
You're right. Yeah.
So this is what's going on, and of course, Menelik writes, a few letters to. At this time, there's all this stuff about, arms should, a bit like today, arms should not be allowed into Africa. There's all this talk, and the same thing is going on at the time. There are private guys going around Africa selling guns all over the place, and there are the countries that are saying this is really bad. It shouldn't happen. And there's discussion about that, and various treaties signed between the European powers. And Menelik says, no, we need guns, because we're being threatened by Muslims everywhere. So he writes to Queen Victoria, and of course he's not allowed to write to Queen Victoria because he's a protectee of the Italians.
Okay.
So he should work through Italy. And Queen Victoria, her secretaries, kind of informs him kindly, like, for this time I'll answer your letter, but you should realize that you are now a protectee of Italy.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's like, what?
Right.
Come again. It's like this is Menelik. This is the emperor of Ethiopia. This is the descendant of the Queen of Sheba.
Right.
And
Solomon. Yeah.
And Solomon. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're saying I'm a protector. So and of course he says no, I'm not. And he tries to talk to the Italian. Says, look, maybe there's been a mistake. Yeah. And of course, now Italy has already announced to everybody that Ethiopia is an Italian kind of, not possession, but is Italy has this kind of monopoly over Ethiopia, and and it can't back down. It has to say, So Menelik says, well, all right, that's it. I am not your protectee. I am. He refers to Queen Victoria as his cousin, or he is a monarch like they are.
He is equal. Yeah.
It is an equal, absolutely is an equal. So he rescinds the Treaty of Wuchale, which he says was basically a dirty trick, by the Italians. And of course, at this point, you can say the war. We're talking about 1892-3, something like that. It takes quite a while for it to become a hot war, but he begins to prepare, and he's understood that Ethiopian independence requires military preparation vis-a-vis Italy, and that preparation begins in say the mid 1894. At the same time, Italy is expanding. Now it also, there's also other sorts of vicissitudes that are happening in the north, but partly there's a great famine that takes place in the area at this time.
Okay.
In the early 1890s, and Menelik's power is still, he's not really able to propel that power in northern Ethiopia in the early 1890s. So Italy thinks it can just march in, and it begins to encroach into the highlands, into the north, and enters essentially what you could call historic, the historic hub of ancient Ethiopia, and Menelik proclaims general mobilization, and in Addis Ababa an army of something like 120,000 troops.
Wow.
is formed, yeah. And they're not just guys with spears, because Menelik has been, has now understood that Italy's one thing, but there are the French, there are the British, there are freebooting arms dealers, and each of these, once Italy loses its kind of supposed monopoly at the Ethiopian court, he is, his advisor, his major advisor, you might call it, his prime minister, is a Swiss, a Swiss guy called Ilge, who of course travels between Europe and Ethiopia. And so essentially you have this gigantic traditional army. He's even procured, machine guns. It's not like, and cannons, revolving cannons, some of the latest, basically the whole, what part of the Ethiopian economy Menelik controls, he uses to spend on arms. As I said, these are kind of testosterone fueled lads. So he's not interested in developing the country yet. And, it's all about buying hardware.
Right.
Who's
got the baddest ammunition.
That's right. And so this army sets off, in 1890. There's this incredible proclamation. Wonderful, the drums are beating through the Ethiopian highlands. Saying the Italians are here to, they're here to destroy Ethiopia. They are here to take, to destroy our Christian heritage. We must defend, and the population flocks to the banner. Italy has no idea this is going on. It's
they didn't know.
Just the kind of, a few, the kind of what everybody's reading about in the books in Africa. It's like just like fire a few shots and they're, they'll run away. That's
this time.
The feeling that there is. So there is a bit of worry because Italy has this experience of various battles with the Ethiopians, and they'd come off worst in a lot of them. So there's a sense, and then they say, all right, so the arm, Italy begins to send more and more troops. To the point in which they've sent something like 25,000, which is a huge number for that era, European. And of course, they have the Askari, that are local recruited soldiers, something like 5,000 of them. So they're essentially accumulating the biggest army that the scramble for Africa seen. The British had conquered, they conquered Nigeria, what is now Nigeria, or with a few thousand troops, and the French had done the same in various areas, because in fact it was precisely that. You were fighting even the famous Zulu that everybody knows about, they had swords, they didn't have rifles, whereas this was a very different situation. The Italians were kind of aware of it, but they still thought, this white, invincibility would because that's what had happened, in the past. So it's an extraordinary thing, the Battle of Adwa. You have, this gigantic army. So some authors call it the biggest army, Menelik's army in 1896. Some, historians, of course, call it the biggest army that had ever actually marched on the African continent. That's how big it is. Maybe going back to classical times or something like that, but it's a gigantic army. It's relative. I mean, it's not brilliantly equipped, but it's relatively well equipped, and it has artillery. It has when these, what can I say? So you've got this gigantic army. It begins marching, and it marches for 6 months. Addis Ababa is very far from Eritrea, and of course, there's no roads or there's paths. But anyway, it marches, and finally, in March 1896, 1st of March, this gigantic army and this very small, because the Italians have got 25,000 troops in Eritrea, but they're not actually capable of getting them from the coast to where the Battle of Adwa takes place, which is in the highlands. They only managed to get about 15,000 troops there which they reckon is probably going to be enough to, and suddenly you have this, gigantic army and this small, that meet, and it's an extraordinary
scene.
It's like, some Ethiopian historian writer called it, like really like the Italian mouse that goes and pokes the cat, it's like that's the differential, and of course, within a couple of hours the Italian army is destroyed,
right?
Absolutely, within a couple of hours. It's unbelievable. This has never happened. Nothing like it. Had happened, and of course, then to get back to your point about Eritrea, then Menelik has the opportunity, of course, to push forward and actually expel the Italians from Eritrea too. Of course, Eritrea is kind of claimed by Ethiopia. It had once been a possession of the Ethiopian monarchs. And he chooses not to do so. I mean, in part because the army is, at this point, this gigantic army is living off the land. It's not easy. So it's beginning to starve, and it has to make its way back down to Shoa, to Addis Ababa.
Right. Okay.
It has now got something like 2,000 Italian prisoners to bring along with it, and he decides not to. I mean, my theory why he doesn't is because he's a great politician. He understands perfectly well that, throwing the Italians back into the sea, it would make it impossible to have a compromise solution. And, I think he understood very well that, although he'd beaten Italy in 1896, Italy was far away, and it could, if it wished,
muster up enough.
Maybe muster up enough, and so, much more intelligent. You can say, well, in the long run, it wasn't a good idea, because that becomes the platform in the 1930s for, for the Italian invasion, which is successful, at least for a while, in 1935. But I think in the situation of 1896, he does the brilliant thing, which is to say, all right, first you renounce the Treaty of Vicale, which the Italians do, and say that it was wrong, and the Italians are forced to say, yes, we were wrong. And secondly, forget about, you can have Eritrea up to the, we'll sort out the borders, but up to the Mareb, that's all he says, and in one sense, as soon as these defeats the Italians, they become friends again. That's the extraordinary thing. And he understands very well that his best interest to keep, and I think at this point, because Menelik, he goes through a process of, learning like anybody. At the beginning, he's a kind of, as I said, a bit of a lad, Amharic aristocrat that, is trying to make his name for himself. He wants to, have everybody look at him and see how cool he is, But I think as the years go by, he becomes more and more what you can say, a great statesman, in the sense of understanding. He's understood how the world works, how the late 19th century world works, and he's understood, for example, that the best, and I think he's also taken it upon himself now not to be just a cool lad, but of course he is the great preserver of this empire that he sees as having lasted 2,000 years, this Christian, Christian island in a sea of Islam, now kind of threatened by everybody. And this is now his job, and of course the best way forward is to have as many Europeans contending for his attention, or contending, because you can play one off against the other, and none will have. So as soon as the Italians are defeated, the way he treats, read about the Italian prisoners, they're treated so unbelievably well. A lot of Ethiopians are saying, look, these guys killed my brother, we want some vengeance on this guy, on these Italians. And he says, no, absolutely, we don't behave like that. Maybe they behave like that towards us.
Yeah.
But we're Christian soldiers. We don't do that. We treat and a lot of the Italians have a pretty good time in their imprisonment.
Right. They're enjoying
And,
that.
they have a good time. They're treated incredibly well. The Ethiopians are really interested in where they come from, and
Right.
it's like it's not there isn't this thing of like you made war against us, because wars, that's life. That's what I
Right.
think it was like for Ethiopians at the time. It's like
Right.
it wasn't this idea, these strange white people that want to conquer us. Of course we fight back, but that's
Yeah.
what happens. Life is
Right.
about. So there's this thing, once you lose, you know
Yeah.
you can talk to each other again.
Right. Right. Let's have a meal.
Yeah, exactly. There is it.
Let's break
and
bread. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
and so Menelik then becomes, now the great statesman. He's won this battle. Italy is left in control of Eritrea, but Eritrea is now very much the kind of junior partner. If
Right.
you look at the history of the governors of Eritrea after the Battle of Adwa, they are the junior partners. They are the ones that they send their emissaries to Menelik, but they have to kneel down and they have to salute him, and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. So he's basically established now, one of, you could say, of course, Europeans have taken over
Yes.
most and are setting up their empires across Africa, but Menelik has done the same, because in some senses his empire is very new.
Yes.
It has territories that had never been part of the old Ethiopian heartland in the south,
Right.
in which he was actually very brutal. The conquest there was very brutal.
Yes.
No different to what Europeans were doing. Slaves are taken and
Yeah.
people are butchered, and
Yeah.
so
In
so
what's the place called? Kaffa? Kaffa?
yeah,
Is that
yeah,
one
yeah.
of the
Yeah,
kingdoms?
and in what becomes, the Somalis are they see the Ethiopia Shoan warriors as they see them as bogeymen. These are, because they've got European arms, whereas the Somalis haven't. So this gives them incredible advantage. And literally in southern Somalia, it is 20 guys with machine guns or with rifles, amongst the Ethiopian, are able to take cattle, women, whatever they want, basically. So there is this big expansion of the Ethiopia, which is a bit of a problem now. What exactly Ethiopia should be and shouldn't.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Menelik has established his empire now, by defeating the Italians, and has consolidated. And of course, I don't know, maybe you want to, we should think maybe like, what does it mean, the fact that you have this independent Ethiopia, for Africa in the following years, and
yes, yeah. I mean, the thing is that for me, like I've always sort of understood Ethiopia to sort of be like a symbol, of resistance, unification, under Menelik, because I mean, for better or worse, I think he unified the nation in some sense, and mustered, a military, complex in order to fight against colonialism, and so, there's parts of it that are sort of inspiring, and like you're like, right on, like I agree. And then there's also parts that, you understand, like there's tension, the slavery, the taking over of other kingdoms, and all of that, and so you see the struggle there, you see the tension, and that's where I for me, I kind of get into this thing of like, it's not the 21st century. We can't say what was going on back then, oh my God, that was totally reprehensible, nothing, we would never do anything like that today. Well, of course, You know, you know,
Yeah,
yeah,
he's not a, Menelik is not a post 1945 African nationalist or
right. Exactly.
he's definitely not that. He is a empire builder who resists colonialism, but whilst building his own empire at the
Right.
same time. And of
Right.
course, who does he see as his peers, as his equals?
Mm-hmm.
It's not African chieftains from somewhere. It's like he sees as his peers the European nations, the European, and these are the guys that he sees as his interlocutors, if you like, on the kind of global stage. That so he's a monarch, like Queen Victoria's, as we were saying before.
Right.
Yeah, he's not some kind of African nationalist in the sense, that becomes, but at the same, and so, and that's of course part of the problem of Emperor Haile Selassie in the 20th century, that he only slowly begins to understand Ethiopia as a leader in the kind of Pan-Africanist ideal, as the first African independent nation. And he only becomes a kind of leader in that in the late 1950s. But
right.
Before that, remember, Ethiopia is this anomaly of an African independent country, whilst the rest of the continent is, of course, ruled by European states.
Right.
And, he has to deal with those. And Menelik and then, Haile Selassie after him have to deal with these European states. They're not about, oh, we're here to free the rest of Africa or something. They are deeply enmeshed in the kind of diplomatic, vicissitudes that are going on in that period. And, primarily the most important thing, certainly for Menelik and then for Haile Selassie, is that, they don't also fall to European colonialism. And, it's a remarkable achievement.
Yes.
That is, and how does it work? Menelik essentially, he signs all the treaty, he becomes a kind of player, an equal player. He's not protected by anybody. He is, that's why the Treaty of Wuchale thing is such a powerful symbol. It's like he doesn't need the protection of a European power. He is an independent monarch. Of course, he's not a democrat. He certainly, there's a fantastic scene at Menelik's court when various gifts. This is actually quite early in the 1880s. Something I write about in my book. There's Italian gifts are being brought. Menelik, he sits on his throne, and the boxes are always open. These are gifts that are coming from Italy, and when the Italian flag, there's an Italian flag that is pulled out, and all the Italians in the kind of, it's a tent, they stand to attention. And of course, the way he interprets this is, this must mean that you really respect, because there's of course the symbol on the Italian flag. There's the symbol of the Savoy monarchy.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and of course, when they stand to attention, with the cross on. When they also, the Italians stand to attention, what Menelik, you would think, they're kind of saluting the Italian. No, he thinks you're saluting your monarch,
yes,
by doing that. And this is the way he sees the world. It's like, it's not about Ethiopian nationalism. It's about Ethiopia as being a, subject to the great, Solomonic monarchy.
Yes.
So he's not a. That's what I'm saying. It's hard to place him in, this kind of 21st century, democratic. He's certainly not that.
Yeah, because
he's ultimately an aristocrat.
Yeah,
he's certainly not thinking about giving the vote to the masses of the Ethiopian population. Far from it. He's not that at all. He's a Christian monarch who but at the same time, he establishes, Ethiopia as an equal state, and it assumes all the trappings of, you have to say, it's of course he has to emulate the European state in order to survive in the European dominated world.
Right.
You know, he has to. So, you know, you have to have your flag, you have to have your national anthem, then you have to have your embassies and, you know, all that kind of stuff. The stuff that is completely normal in the 1950s, you know, every new African state has to acquire these. It's not even, you know, even in the 1920s, you know, they have to acquire a football team, you know. These are all the things that you know, make the modern nation state. And from that point of view, Ethiopia is an absolute, you know, is the example for all other African states. And of course, in the 1920s, he joins, you know, this is Menelik dies in 1910, I think 1911, something like that. But, you know, Ethiopia is, you know, joins the League of Nations as an independent state, you know, the only Black African state that is. So, you know, and this stands as a kind of extraordinary, you know, this was the era in which, you know, no Black country could stand on its own two legs. It needed European white, you know, whereas Ethiopia was the, you know, was the exception. And so therefore, you know, some people say, well, it's because Ethiopians an exception is Christian, or, you know, they fought the Italians, you know, the Italians, yeah, well, you know, they're not, if it had been the British or the French, things would have been different.
Right.
There was that argument. But the other argument is, no, you know, if Ethiopia can do it, why can't other places in Africa do it? And if they can defeat Italians, well, one day, you know, the Battle of Adwa is greeted by, you know, and the news travels across Africa. It's not, you know, I mean, I've read about, you know, West African. So this is in the British Empire, you know, in today Nigeria. You know, there's a lot of, you know, in Lagos, there's a lot of independent Black African newspapers that are being published at the time. And, you know, they greet this as like, even though they're part of the British Empire, they greet this as like, you know, this is finally happened. This is, you know, now is the turning point. The Battle of Adwa shows that we too can make a nation. So it becomes an incredibly, in America, of course, you know, W. Du Bois is, you know, he says this is a turning point. This is, and there's the whole kind of Ethiopianism, you know, kind of the idea that Ethiopia proves, you know, the Black man can stand on his own 2 feet and can, you know, can effectively join the international community as an equal, you know, across, you know, and so it's a remarkable inspiration. For, you know, everywhere. I mean,
well, as you can tell,
I mean, the Rastafarian movement in Jamaica. I mean, I don't know a huge amount about it, but what I do know is that they watch. What I've understood is that in Jamaica, you know, when Haile Selassie is crowned in 1930, as Emperor of Ethiopia, you know, I mean, there is all the Marcus Garvey stuff and all that, but there are guys in in Jamaica that are watching at the cinema because, of course, the British go and film this in coronation, in Addis Ababa, and then it's released. You know, you know those newsreels like the new crown of Ethiopia is, you know, that kind of, those kind of you know, the kind of newsreels I'm talking. And these newsreels are seen at the cinema in, you know, in downtown.
What do they call it?
Kingston, Jamaica, or whatever.
Yeah, the British pate. The British pate, you know this one?
Yeah, that's right. These newsreels are watched in you know, in downtown Jamaica, and of course, you know, so they see this, you know, Ethiopia, that is this country mentioned in the Bible, and suddenly they see this monarch, you know, that is Black and you know, being. And you know, it begins, you know, they begin to almost worship him, don't they? You know, in the Rastafarian. And of course, because he is the incredible symbol of an independent Ethiopia, and you know, that accepted amongst the nations, in a way that, you know, there's no other parallel to it.
And then and then and this is my last point, because I know you're probably very busy this morning there. So happy weekend to you.
Yeah.
My last point is that, I think it also, and I want to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
There was sort of a ripple effect, amongst the African diaspora, right? That, like, these guys, they are fighting for all of us.
Yeah.
They are representing all of us, and it's like I remember, I don't know if Marcus Garvey said this or not, but there's a Bible verse that says, in Ethiopia shall lift up his hands to God, and that sort of prophetic message, that one day we'll be liberated, one day we'll be free. I think that resonated with so many people.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you, and this is my last question.
Yeah.
How did the Italian diaspora or Italian Americans feel about that, that war, losing the Battle of Adwa?
Well, I mean, I don't know a huge amount about this, because partly I don't even know if the research has been done, but I know that, before the Battle of Adwa, there are various other, battles that take place before the final defeat, in which Ambalagi, Makale, these are smaller battles in which the Italians are always defeated. But nevertheless, in this, and the Battle of Dogali I'd mentioned in 1887, and amongst Italians in Italy, there was, rather than this sense of, that's it, we messed up, let's stop, which is what happens after Adwa. There's a kind of, amongst many, a desire, a lot of people volunteer to go and fight and to avenge those that were, and so on. And I think that this repeats itself amongst the Italian migrants in America as well, in the sense that, after all, Italian migrants, they're not, one imagines that, they go to America and the contact with Italy is actually lost, but it's not quite like that. They go to America and, lots of migrants are actually going backwards and forwards. It doesn't take that long. It takes a few weeks now to just go, to get a steamer from, and of course, lots of Italians are, often in South America. Remember, probably the majority of migrants don't go to the US, but they go to Argentina and Uruguay and Brazil, and they're Southern Hemisphere. So an Italian peasant could work for the harvest at home and then go to South America, where of course the harvest was happening in the opposite months, because in the Southern Hemisphere. And because he was unemployed, say, for 6 months, and work in Argentina and then go back again. So the contact is always there. And of course, Italians, in some ways you can say Italians discover themselves to be Italian when they migrate. Yeah, they because everybody is treating them as Italians, whereas at home there's very difference between if you're from the south or the north, or if you're Venetian, if you're Sicilian. Often the migration experience pushes you all together.
Yes.
And you kind of, often historians of Italian migration talk about this, is they become Italians as soon as they leave Italy.
Yes.
And because they're regarded as such. Yes. And I suppose in some ways they become, it's like for me as well. I'm like this mad Italy football fan, yeah. Because I've always lived as a kind of second generation migrant, and it's like everybody looks at you, and when your team wins, it's like you feel your bragging rights. You feel you walk around with your head held high, and stuff like that. And I think that Italy's kind of military performance becomes, for many Italians living abroad, something that they should be proud about.
Yes.
When they do well. Of course, with the defeat, I know that in places like New York, there are people that, there's various Italian newspapers that, apparently Italians flock to the newspaper, to sign up because they want to go out there
Yeah.
to sign up for the Italian army, and and a few hundred people apparently trying to do that. But once Italy itself, rescinds on trying to avenge Adwa, and that's another discussion why that is the case.
Sure.
But Italy reveals itself to be very divided, because once the battle happens, Italy's got this choice, hasn't it? Either to kind of, do what the British did after Isandlwana, or, they lose against the Zulus, but then they mount, or it had happened in the Sudan, the Sudan as well, of course, Britain had been defeated, Gordon had been killed. But so Italy has this choice, and for a whole variety of reasons, Italy, realizes that, either it mounts a huge expedition, which would be incredibly expensive. Would the Italian population support this campaign? Don't know. I mean, it's like Afghanistan or whatever in, America is like, you can, if you're doing well, everything goes well, and, most of your country supports you, but, to actually mount a gigantic campaign, is it worth it?
Yeah.
And in 1896, I think most Italians were like, probably not. We got into this without thinking too hard, and we burnt our fingers. Unlucky for us. Everybody else manages to conquer, enormous countries with a few guns, and whereas we ended up fighting against the most powerful monarch in Africa.
A formidable foe.
What? For what? What did we get? Eritrea, which is like, essentially, a desert with a,
right.
with
beautiful women.
Yeah, that's right. Apart from that, the what did we get out of it? So there's a big movement in Italy that is saying, no, this is not what we're about. And I think the Italian community in once the whole thing kind of boils over, of course, there's an embarrassment, but that's what Italy has to live with. And it does, there's an embarrassment amongst Italian nationalists. And of course, one of the origins of fascism and all that is definitely the defeat of Adwa, because in Italy, it's not merely accepted by everybody. Some people accept it. Other people, it's, considered a humiliation. And it's a humiliation that they look forward to somehow one day, So once Adwa happens, a whole, it's like a whole new set of doors open. One door is, the independent African nation. The other door is, in a sense, in Italy, there's a kind of a process of democratization that takes place afterwards that refuses this kind of, at least for a while, this kind of imperial, and Italy looks inwards, and it begins to talk about, economic development rather than, expansion and empire and so on. But another door that opens is that of, what you could call an Italian far right, that, this is Italy again humiliated. This is Italy that needs to, yeah, I mean, needs to do what we hope to do, but do it better. Like we need to conquer, an empire. We need to, go to war. We need to prepare our population, for the future conflict. And of course, this, does have repercussions. And it's interesting to contrast, because when Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935. Situation is very different, but the Italian community in America and so on is very supportive of that, at least some of them, because there are, of course, socialists and that are not that, but but by this stage, 1935, the First World War's happened, lots of other things have happened, and fascism has come to power, and Italy is supposedly asserting itself on the world stage, and for a lot of Italians, there's the famous, boxing match, isn't there, in 1935, Joe Louis against the Italian kind of 7 foot tall.
Yes.
In America in 1935, just as Italy's preparing to conquer Ethiopia. And of course, for blacks in America, this is seen as, a bit like Italy versus Ethiopia, Italy identity versus Italian identity. And for Italians, it's Carnera. It's, this, because it's like Italians, they were, for many, you know, seen as the lowest rung of, you know, American society. I mean, of course, they're not, you know, in the horrible way American society is organized in this ethnic, but
Yeah.
Italians were the lowest, you know, the whites. Maybe they weren't quite white. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this looking at what Italy's doing and conquering an empire in Ethiopia, it's not so much against blacks, but it's like asserting Italy's greatness
Yes.
along with the other European powers. And, you know, this is what fascism is about. Of course, Carnera is defeated by Joe Louis. But Joe Louis is, you know, a perfect gentleman about it. It's not about black against white. It's just we're just two fighters.
Right.
Hey,
I'm just in the game, man. Come on. Let's just yeah.
So you know, there is a lot more, but you know, also Italian fascism has its organizations by that stage in amongst the Italian community.
Yes.
And you know, they're pushing very much for you know, for support. Whereas I think after 1896, as far as I know, it's, you know, it peters out rather quickly. Although, of course, Italy does then have this other big war in 1911. So we're only talking 14 years or so afterwards, which, you know, is very popular amongst Italians abroad, and, you know, some of whom sign up and go back to Italy, you know, to join the Italian army to go and fight in Libya. So you know, they're always a kind of resource for Italian imperialism in some sense, but there are of course also Italians that are very much against, you know, it's divided.
Yeah. Well, Pep, this has been a very interesting conversation, man. I really have enjoyed this, and I hope we can kind of pick back up sometime in the near future to kind of go into sort of the, you know, I should say the 20th century and, you know, Italy's involvement in Africa. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think that would be great. I enjoyed the conversation really a lot. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, let's do it again, brother. I appreciate it. Happy Saturday.
And happy, it's still Friday.
Yeah.
So I'm living your future at the moment.
Right. You're living my future. Okay. Ciao.
Nice to talk. See you, Shannon.
You too. Okay.